I now recognize the senator from Alaska, Ms. Murkowski, for her opening statement with respect to the Interior bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased that we are here before full committee this morning to mark up the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill. This is a bill that has been long overdue. The last time that an Interior bill was reported by the Appropriations Committee was 6 years ago. It was July 7th of 2009. That was the 2010 Interior bill that was headed up by the fine work of Senator Feinstein and Senator Alexander. They know that this is a tough budget, but that was, in fact, the last time we have seen an Interior bill before this committee. So it's a good thing that we are back to what we all describe as regular order here, allow the committees to do its work. It's tough work, and my colleague, Senator Udall, knows and appreciates that, and I thank him for his willingness to work with us through some very, very difficult issues. I do expect vigorous debate and amendments today, because this is an opportunity, folks, that we just haven't had in 6 years. So let's bring it out. Let's have the discussions today. This bill includes funding for all of the major federal land management agencies. This is the Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service. But in addition to our public lands that we have an obligation for, we also have an obligation for our First Peoples. Funding for essential Indian health, education, and resource management programs through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service. We also cover important cultural institutions like the Smithsonian, the National Gallery of Art, the National Endowments for Arts and Humanities. And it also provides funding for the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay. So essentially, contained within this budget, we have the responsibility for our land, for our environment, and our First Peoples. It's a big list. For some of the programs that are funded in this bill, the needs are almost limitless, but we're forced to live within a finite amount of money set in law by the Budget Control Act that was signed by the President back in 2011. Now, when the President presented his proposal, he chose to ignore the budget caps set by statute, and he was thus able to avoid some of the very tough and difficult decisions that you see in this bill together. The administration's request for the 2016 Interior bill is approximately $32.2 billion. The subcommittee's allocation is slightly more than $30 billion, which is roughly $2.2 billion less than the request. This increases to $2.6 billion when you factor in the difference in how the administration proposes to fund fire, which I'll discuss in just a moment here. But also, given that certain cost increases for contract support costs for tribes and funding the 10-year average for fire must be provided under CBO's scoring rules, the allocation is effectively $250 million below last year. This is the reality of the numbers that we are dealing with. In spite of the fact that we had a limited amount of money, we were able to find a number of increases that were requested by the administration and supported by many, many members of the committee. These include increases for the BIA, the IHS, the National Park Service for its centennial, conservation efforts for the sage grouse. But to accommodate even a portion of these funding increases, we had to look to some very difficult areas. Two important, very important infrastructure programs that I strongly support, the EPA's Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. But I do think it's important for colleagues to note here that even at the level of $1.822 billion in this bill, this legislation provides for more water infrastructure funds than the President requested last year when he chose to live within the congressional budget constraints. So I'd like to give a quick rundown here of the important funding priorities that are contained within the bill. For operation of the National Park Service in its centennial year, we provide funding for new park units and an increase of $30 million for cyclic and rehabilitation maintenance. We provide an additional $55 million for deferred maintenance in the construction account. We all recognize that we have to deal with the maintenance backlog within Park Service budget. Within the Bureau of Land Management, we provide the requested $45 million increase for on-the-ground conservation efforts aimed at preventing an ESA listing of the sage grouse across its 11-state range. For the Forest Service, we provide the requested $20.6 million increase necessary to boost timber outputs and support local economies, as well as $13.2 million increase for the hazardous fuels program to reduce the risk of fire. In the two main agencies that deliver services for the Indian community, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Service, we did our best to provide as much funding as possible to the programs that are absolutely critical to Indian country. For both agencies, we provided full contract support costs as required by the courts, an $81 million increase over the current level. We also created a separate appropriations account for contract support costs to protect other Indian programs from having to pay the contract support cost shortfalls if an agency underestimates these costs. We've seen this borrowing before. It's wrong. It doesn't work. We've corrected it. Within the BIA, the bill provides $10 million so that for the first time, tribal court funding will be available for the PL 280 states, which have not previously received support. And providing funding to these states was a key recommendation of the Indian Law and Order Commission report from November of 2013. We also provide additional resources for programs that provide services to children and families facing domestic violence, substance abuse, and related issues. And then within BIA construction, the bill provides a $6.3 million increase, which will allow the agency to complete the next school on its priority list. For the Indian Health Service, we include the full request of $17.8 million for staffing packages. We also provide additional funding for construction to help address the agency's $2 billion backlog of priority construction facilities. We provide $40 million for maintenance and improvement as well as sanitation facilities construction. For those of us, and there are many on the committee here, who have a significant tribal presence in our states, we know how crucial these kinds of infrastructure programs are to improve the conditions in our villages and in our reservations nationwide. We've made some important improvements for the wildland fire management program. Right now, my state is lit up. We have major fires north of Anchorage, south of Anchorage, and in the interior. It's critical to me that we provide the necessary resources for our firefighters. So what we've done is we've provided a total of $3.6 billion for the Department of Interior and the Fire Service for fire programs, not including the $1 billion in emergency funds. We also provide $38 million above the President's request for hazardous fuels reduction activities to ensure that we're actively making progress in reducing fire risk. What many of you have come to me to talk about is how we can end the practice of fire borrowing. And this bill includes a major structural change in budgeting for fire that will end this practice of fire borrowing. It's modeled on the administration's proposal and several bipartisan efforts here in Congress, but rather than moving significant portions of the fire program off budget, the cap adjustment within the bill maintains the more than decade-old practice of the administration requesting and Congress funding the 10-year average cost for fire suppression. And only when these fire suppression amounts are exhausted can the cap adjustment be triggered. Stopping fire borrowing should have enormous benefit for both the Department of the Interior and the Fire Service. Land managers will not have to hold back funds in anticipation of a catastrophic fire season, and I think that's what we're all afraid of this year. Holding back funds leads to lost seasons of work in the field and ultimately increases costs as projects are delayed over longer periods. This bill pulls back on EPA's regulatory overreach on both the funding end and with policy provisions. The bill supports funding at the EPA for on-the-ground cleanup while cutting funds from the regulatory areas that are working on the most contentious and arguably unlawful rulemakings. We provide an additional $15 million for the Superfund program, which should help clean up one additional Superfund site. And at the same time, we reduce funding from the EPA's legal department, where they're finding somewhat creative justifications for writing rules that go far beyond what Congress intended when important environmental laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act were enacted. One of the important policy provisions in this bill prevents the agency from implementing its controversial and expansive change to the definition of the waters of the United States. And rather than ascribing this as a poison pill, as has been suggested, this is incredibly important to the people in my state and incredibly important to the people in many of our states, whether you're rural or urban, in terms of the ability, the opportunity to allow for any development to go forward. I've heard from so many of you, not only on this committee, but within the body, that we must deal with many of these provisions that we're facing. I want to reiterate that while this bill contains what I believe are sensible policy provisions, they shouldn't overshadow other important programmatic increases included in the bill for conservation. Within the EPA budget, we provide an additional $62 million above the President's request for EPA's geographic programs, which provide cleanup funds for some of America's most important waterways, whether it's the Puget Sound, the Chesapeake Bay, the Great Lakes. Within Fish and Wildlife, we provide additional funding for state wildlife grants that help prevent the species from becoming listed under the ESA. There's additional funding for NACA, the North American Wetlands Conservation Program. There's increase for the BLM's National Landscape Conservation System, increase for recreational access for our sportsmen, as well as a $7 million increase for the LWCF stateside program, which is the largest increase to this part of LWCF since 2006. So again, I want to thank my colleague, Senator Udall, for helping. He has been a good partner to work with. He and his staff have been very accommodating and helping us as we move forward with, again, a budget area that is complex and difficult and sometimes contentious, but I think there are many, many priorities that are reflected from both sides of the aisle contained within the bill. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and after you recognize Senator Udall for his opening comments, we do have a manager's package of amendments that we would like to offer to the committee and propose that they be adopted en bloc.